Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
A very good morning and warm welcome once again to Money Sense. Brought to you this morning with Neville Hicks, Christoph Barnett and myself, Simon Caudry.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, gentlemen. So on today's show, we're dedicating it to discussing the recently introduced pension legislation. It passed in the House a couple of weeks ago, or maybe a month ago now, and there's been quite a wide public discussion regarding the changes to this pension law. There have been some petitions, some online protests. On the other hand, many of the changes seem to be, in my opinion, very much bringing the legislation into line with generally accepted practices in other developed countries around the world. And so we're very delighted to be joined this morning by the Honourable Minister Tara Rivers, who is the Minister of Education, Employment and Gender Affairs. And we're going to be discussing the pension law as it has been changed. So, Minister, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you to you all for having me.
It's our pleasure. I want to start off this conversation. There's been some changes to the pension law, and one of the things that I personally feel about is that perhaps we get lost in some of the weeds sometimes without talking about the big picture as to why we have a pension legislation in the Cayman Islands. So let's just sort of paint the picture. What happens to somebody if they've lived and worked in Cayman all their life and they haven't saved for a pension? Is there a social security system? What happens to that person upon retirement?
Well, the short answer to your question is no. There is no such thing as a social security system here in the Cayman Islands as you would find in some other jurisdictions. And I mean, harken back to pre-1998. Basically, what you've just described was the norm as it relates to the employees or the workers of the country at the time before the original pension law came into force. That is, people could work their entire lives with a company, several companies, and at the end of their kind of working life and then they're ready to retire, they would really have, unless they were very prudent with their savings or they had some other investments in terms of land or some sort of acquisitions that they could possibly sell in order to support themselves, they really left the workforce with pretty much nothing in hand. And so as a means to ensure that people live as comfortably as possible in their golden years, not having the concern about being able to afford to retire, so to speak, the need to have a robust kind of pension system is certainly something that I think the country needs to continue. And the purpose of, and I'm glad that you kind of in your introduction brought in the idea of best practice, the purpose of these changes really was to bring our regime up to date with what is kind of international best practice in the area of pension and pension regulation and pension legislation. It was very much informed by information as it relates to what the rest of the world is doing in order to, as I said, strengthen their pension legislation. So
that what you're saying then is that the principal purpose for introducing the new legislation and some of the changes that are in the law, and we'll talk about those in some more detail, was all about bringing our legislation and our practices up to best standards around the world.
Well, that was certainly one of the kind of underlying, that was the kind of overarching philosophy for why we felt it was necessary to make these amendments. But they were actually, as I said, informed principally by a number of key reports that had been done over the past several years as it relates to the regime, one being the Mercer report of 2007. So from 2007, there was this kind of review of the pension regime from a legislative, from an administrative, and also just from a kind of actuarial perspective as to where we are and where we should be and what kind of changes should be after having the pension regime at that point about 10 years. That, as I said, that report was done in 2007, and the former administration didn't really do anything to advance what was put forward, as I said, during that time. So that was really so the recommendations coming out of that report. We can talk to some of those in detail as it relates to the changes reflected in the amended law. That was a big part of the basis of the changes that we brought into force. Another report that was done in 2010 was the Office of the Complaints Commissioner's own motion investigation, known as the penny pinching pensions, and that really was a look at the department's ability to enforce the law and what are some of the, I guess, gaps in the law as it relates to being able to actually have the kind of compliance. And there were some compliance issues, obviously, we've heard about during the years. So really, those two reports kind of acted as the research foundation. And then, of course, we went out to public consultation. As you know, it was a very extensive public consultation process. So based on the information contained in those reports, and there were also some key policy objectives that the government wanted to achieve through these changes. One of them being to remove this notion of a normal retirement age and in replacing it with the concept of a age of pension entitlement. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like it's a semantic change, but it is significant in the sense that it's more of an elective type of situation. So when you reach the age of 65, because also the change in the definition was introduced, but also a raising of the age from 60 to 65 was also introduced, and that is to reflect the fact that we are living longer. Mm-hmm. Our life expectancy is longer. Certainly. We're more able to contribute. In some instances, we have to contribute because we have obligations that extend beyond. So that was a key policy objective of the government. So that was also reflected. And also to introduce more requirements for pension plans to educate and inform the members. I mean, I think that was a key aspect of people not being aware of the purpose of pension and what's happening with their pensions. In some instances, they only received pension statements once per annum. Many of the other plans did more frequent, but their law only required once per annum. And up until the change that was made recently, the law didn't require annual general meetings. Now there is that requirement. So people have at least an opportunity once a year to speak directly with their administrators and to find out and ask whatever questions. And the frequency of pension statements are also up to twice per annum as a minimum as well.
So let's just take a few of those in turn.
Mm-hmm.
The first one, and I want to go back to those parties that were used as consultants to help change the law. Because I think sometimes the perception can be you've gone out and you've hired someone to do something, and it's important to explain who that party is. And so Mercer, who you said were instrumental in helping to design the framework for the new law, advising on what is best practice. To a lot of people, Mercer won't mean anything. It will be a name that they've never heard of, not familiar with. Are you able to explain a little bit about who they are?
Well, I'm actually hoping that you might be able to add some colour to that, given that your area of technical expertise. Certainly, you probably would be much more versed as to what
Well, Christoph,
they do,
are you able to sort of give us a bit of background as to Mercer and who they are as an organisation?
Well, they're a global consultancy organization that has expertise in pension systems around the world, and their benefit is that it's hard for us to get that sort of organizational knowledge and visit every pension system and see the pros and cons and so on and the challenges that are faced. But they can come with that knowledge and then compare us sort of to that benchmark and then our needs and sort of give us the report which reflects that background knowledge. Now, just touching on some of those, the first couple of changes you mentioned in terms of the change in retirement age and change in the salary cap, I think it's important to remember that this is, as pension participants, this is still our money. And you're absolutely right about the life expectancy. Neville and I looked it up a few weeks back, and in Cayman is 88 years old. Now, let's think about that, because if the retirement age pre these changes was 60 and you have 28, is my math correct, Neville? 28 years, right, to live. Well, who's going to pay for that, right? So these things need to be updated. So Mercer comes in and says, okay, well, 28 years, how much does that cost? Well, how much is going to be contributed? And they say, well, you need more contributions or you need to retire later. It's still our money. So when the age goes to 65, it's just saying put more of your money into your account that you will have for your life.
And so when I was doing my research for the show, one of the items on this petition that was going around was, why did we raise the pension age from 60 to 65? You're stopping us getting access to our money. And from what I'm hearing, the answer to that question is, well, what is the answer to that question? Is it because, well, you're going to live longer, so if you take it all now, you're not going to have any money by the time you're 82, 83? Is that kind of the answer to the question then? Well,
I think in many respects that is the case, because we are living longer, and because, if you stop working, if you stop contributing in the kind of local economy, earning an income and whatnot, then obviously, unless you and of course pensions, I think the key to point out too is pensions is one way to ensure that you have some quality of life when you do retire. It shouldn't be your only. You shouldn't put all your eggs in this one basket, because I think that's the other thing that people need to understand too, is that pensions is not expected to be 100% income replacement of what you were earning while you were working. What is accepted, the accepted norm kind of throughout the world is anywhere between 60 to 70% of what you were earning you is the kind of threshold of what pension should be kind of replacing. So certainly if you want to continue to have the lifestyle that you live while you are working, you should try to make some other investments. But certainly that's one issue. Christophe touched on the point about raising the cap, and I didn't actually speak to that yet, but I will speak to that now. In tandem with raising the age, the cap of your maximum pensionable earnings per annum moved from 60,000 CI to 87,000 CI. And so that again reflects the fact, and that really is the kind of inflation adjusted figure that was proposed in the Mercer report back in 2007. Again, that's, over 8 years ago. So the Economics and Statistics Office did a calculation for us, and in the Mercer report, I think they recommended 72. And so just given today's, dollar value, it equated to be 87. Again, it allows, and that means anybody who's making anywhere between $87,000 per annum and below have to contribute up to that point. Anybody making more than that, it would be considered additional voluntary contributions if they do decide to make pension contributions above that cap. Again, so it's to ensure that we do have, we know we're living longer, so we want to make sure that people are better prepared. And as Christophe said, it is your money. So it's not like this is some kind of grab by the government, because I think that was another one of the comments that I've seen, I think on either the petition or whatnot, that people feel that, this is just a way for the government to hold on to your money. Well, no, it's a way to make sure that you have a bigger pot because you're contributing longer, and also you're contributing more. So when you do go to retire, you have less of a concern about, am I going to be able to afford to pay my bills when I no longer have a steady income coming in? Can I, continue to help in any way, from familial obligations and otherwise? So it's basically a way to help people to plan for the future. And I think that kind of cultural shift is something that's really important, I think, for us as well, too. Because as I said before, the way to do so was kind of the accumulation of land. And people had land and they passed on land to their, future generations. That's not the norm anymore. Many people don't have that sort of ability to inherit, real property as they did before because of the changing in nature of society. So that's why pensions are even that much more important to help us to prepare for the future.
I think too, an important thing, for pensioners to consider is, not only are you saving that additional 5 years, but you're also getting matched by your employer. So you're almost getting, an additional double the money for another 5 years, which again allows to grow and be invested properly and through, diversification. So I think there's that automatic mechanism for another 5 years, but also there's that matching contribution, which, again, certainly benefits people. They might feel like they should have access to it inherently right away, but over the long term, especially as we're getting older and living longer, it's certainly something that's of tremendous benefit, so that you don't run out of money.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point. The matching aspect still continues up until the your age of pension entitlement. But I also want to remind the public too that the idea of having, the early retirement option is still kept in the law. So the law does allow you to access your pensions earlier than the 65 years. It is, the age band has shifted. So it went from 50 to 55. So the 55 to 65 would still be considered the early retirement option. And that, obviously is governed by the regime that's set out in the legislation. So that's still an option, but also just to for people that may be at that 60-year mark, or, there will be transitional provisions that are built into the order when the law actually comes into force. So we the government is cognizant, and we are aware of the concerns of people who have reached the kind of retirement age now as defined under the old law, or who may be at that point where they were considering retirement. There will certainly be provisions to kind of take into consideration those individuals. So just so people understand that.
So we're going to take a brief break right now. When we come back, I want to ask you and talk about the implication of one of the other changes, which is the length of time before you can take your pension off island or move it to another approved pension provider, and also just touch on something you were saying there about some of the other changes, and just focus on some of the other changes that the pension law has made. So we're going to take a brief break and be back in a couple of minutes.
One TradeX knows there's more than one way to invest. One TradeX is the Cayman Islands' only fully licensed online broker-dealer, offering discount trading services to individual investors and traders, hedge fund managers, and family offices. One TradeX has the most competitive online trading prices of any offshore broker worldwide, with no custody or management fees, free demonstration accounts, and no charge to open an account with a $5,000 minimum deposit. Trade stocks, options, futures, bonds, and Forex. Learn more and open your free demo account today at OneTradeX.com. One TradeX, the Cayman Islands' #1 choice for online brokerage.
Money Sense, the only personal finance radio show in the Cayman Islands, hosted by Simon Caudry from the CFA Society Cayman Islands.
This is Money Sense.
One TradeX knows there's more than one way to invest. One TradeX is the Cayman Islands' only fully licensed online broker-dealer, offering discount trading services to individual investors and traders, hedge fund managers, and family offices. One TradeX has the most competitive online trading prices of any offshore broker worldwide, with no custody or management fees, free demonstration accounts, and no charge to open an account with a $5,000 minimum deposit. Trade stocks, options, futures, bonds, and Forex. Learn more and open your free demo account today at OneTradeX.com. One TradeX, the Cayman Islands' #1 choice for online brokerage.
This is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community. Brought to you by the CFA Society Cayman Islands and sponsored by One TradeX.
And now, more Money Sense.
Welcome back to Money Sense. We're joined this morning with Minister Rivers as we discuss the pension legislation that recently passed in the Legislative Assembly, what it means for you and what it means for your investment options and the state of yourself upon retirement. Thank you again for joining us, Minister, and great to have you back on the show.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
So we were talking in the first half just some of the changes that had been made and trying to address some of the concerns that have been itemised on social media and such like, and we've discussed about the change in the retirement age, why it's gone from 60 to 65. We've discussed why the maximum pensionable earnings have increased to $80,000. What we haven't discussed is one of the other changes that's made a few headlines, which is why it takes now 2 years upon leaving the island before one can transfer one's pension to an alternative provider somewhere else. So the popular comments as I read it is that why should I have to wait 2 years to transfer my money to another pension provider? If I've left the island, I've left the island. Why are you assuming I'm going to come back and be a burden on society and all the rest of it? So what was the rationale for this change, and why has it been enacted?
Well, there's kind of two changes in this area that I think are important to discuss, and one is the transferability, and one is this idea of a refund that existed previously. So I'll take the transfer change first. So in order to transfer, as you said, your funds to another pension provider overseas or some sort of pension arrangement, there is now a waiting period of 2 years, as well as not having any contributions to the fund and being absent from the jurisdiction for that period of time. And that's because the reality in Cayman is that many workers, even though we have a high kind of expat population, the transient worker population often comes and goes. And so this idea of the rollover, which is a period of time that, you're required if you reach that threshold, people would often leave, but then come back if their opportunities allow to do so. So within the government, and this is based on the kind of data and what the department was seeing with respect to people kind of coming and going. And so we felt that in order to, indicate that there is that kind of true break from the jurisdiction, a threshold period of time was introduced, and that way it was determined that 2 years would be reasonable. The original recommendation was 3 years, but based on, public consultation and the government listening to the views of the people when we went out with the original discussion bill, we decided then, well, you know what, 2 years would be appropriate because it's still longer than the mandated rollover period through from the immigration.
In other words, you have to be off island for a year before you can come back to work.
Correct.
Once you get to your, whatever it is, that 8-9 years now, whatever it might be.
Correct. So setting it at that same threshold wouldn't necessarily accomplish what we're trying to accomplish, which is to basically say, yes, if you've left the jurisdiction and you have no real kind of intention at the time anyway to return, then once you've reached that 2-year period, then you're able to transfer. And again, that is something that, would be facilitated through the pension plans and of course, the department would then be able to ascertain then the similar type of arrangement wherever you're going. The other change, which also I know has caused some discussion, shall we say, amongst especially the expat population, is the fact that you can no longer get this idea of a refund of your pensions. Now, I may be wrong, but in the research that was done and presented to me, I am not aware of any other real jurisdiction where you can have this idea of a lump sum refund upon leaving the jurisdiction. Certainly, the major ones like Canada, the US, UK, it doesn't exist. And so this was a bit of an anomaly in our pension legislation, I believe. And so, again, making sure that the purpose of pension is intended wherever you are. The government felt it was necessary to after a certain period of time, this idea of, you leave the jurisdiction, and currently it's, within 6 months. If you've left the jurisdiction within 6 months and you haven't made any contributions to your pensions for 2 years and you have been unemployed, then you're able to access this as a lump sum payment. Again, in many instances, we've seen that people have accessed this and gone off and had, extravagant holidays or whatever they've decided to spend this money on, not saving it for retirement, and then, of course, coming back to this jurisdiction or wherever they go and then not be any better when it comes to preparing for their retirement. Again, the purpose of pensions is to try to make sure that you're able to live as comfortably as possible with the aim, again, of reaching that 60 to 70% income replacement. And by raising the age and also raising the income, maximum income pensionable earnings to 87, we are within that acceptable band for the band for the most part. So those changes were significant from that in that regard. Those are the two kind of changes as it relates to the refunds. So the refunds are transfers. So after the law comes into effect, that at that point then it'll only be possible to transfer your funds to a similar type of pension regime in whichever jurisdiction that you move to.
I think you've hit on a point which deserves a reiteration in many respects, because the idea, I think, must be in someone's mind who says, well, I've worked in Cayman, say, for 3 or 4 years. I'm going to leave Cayman. I want to take my pension as a lump sum and do what I wish with it. That person presumably has forgotten that they may well retire somewhere else in the world. They are still going to grow old. And I guess it's rather like psychologists have done studies on children where they say, well, you give a child one sweet and you say, would you like that now or in 2 hours, I'll give you 2 sweets if you can wait that long. Most children will take the 1 sweet. It's difficult for human beings to delay satisfaction. And I guess what people try to say is, well, I'll take my money now and I won't worry about the future because that's so uncertain. I don't know when it is. I can't rationalise myself with grey hair and all the rest of it. So therefore, I want to spend that money now. And it's not about keeping money in Cayman per se. It's just about making sure that everybody who lives and who has lived and worked in Cayman has some sort of provision for their retirement. Absolutely, irrespective of you retire here or you retire wherever else you go. Like you said, the one certainty is that we're going to grow old. Of course, there are tragic situations where that doesn't happen. But again, if you're looking at, the kind of probability and statistical expectation, we are expected to grow old and we will need to at some point rely on either savings, pensions or some other investment regime in order to be able to support yourself when you are old. So talking about growing old, when someone does get to the pension age and is thinking about retiring, now we're in an unusual situation whereby a lot of people who are at retirement age now or approaching it haven't had a pension mandated by law for a number of years, so their pot of pension savings is relatively small. But for those over the next 20 years who are going to be at that stage, The current legislation as to what one can do with one's pension, what one can do with the pension pot upon retirement is relatively limited. So what's the scope and what are the opportunities to say, well, let's broaden that so that you can do more things, so you can buy different policies, different annuities and stuff like that. Where does the law, what's happening with respect to that?
Well, the second phase of this kind of pension reform, first we dealt with the actual pension law, which kind of outlines the kind of overall regulatory framework. The issues as it relates to investments is actually related to the investment regulations, which are some regulations specifically there to support the law. And that's what the ministry and the department is looking at currently, is looking at how we can revise those regulations, because again, the pension regime has not been changed. Since it was introduced in 1998, this is the first time we've had any fundamental, substantive, overarching review and changes brought into force. So the similar situation existed with the regulations. So the regulations haven't changed since it was introduced. And as you said, because it was introduced and there was an understanding that there would be a time to build up the pension pot. I think the restrictions were quite limited, or they were actually quite formulaic as to what can happen when. We are looking to make some changes to that again to reflect best practice, but also to broaden the opportunities for people to have other investments, either investments locally or, if you are younger, whether or not you're able to take on more risky investments because you're going to be in it for the long haul, versus if you're older and you're closer to the age of retirement, it may be necessary to have a more conservative portfolio. So these kinds of issues are being considered as we speak, as it relates to the changes to the investment regulations. The other thing that's also being looked at, and we will certainly be looking to get, the kind of investment expertise to assist in developing an appropriate schedule, is the kind of pay down, the monthly pay down once you are at retirement age. Currently, it's, you can either buy an annuity or you can opt to have like the pay down of, I think it's $1,000 per month. Again, that schedule has not changed since it was introduced in the late 90s. But we do recognize that there are people here that have a greater pot, and that there should be some there should be some provisions for those individuals. So again, this is something that we'll need to bring in some kind of actuarial.
Well, as each year goes by, the number of people who are in that situation is going to increase.
Correct.
And so the importance of making those changes also increases, presumably.
Absolutely, and so that's the next phase, which is, as I said, we're undertaking to do that within the next financial year, is looking at making some amendments to these key pieces of legislation, the regulations, and then also the investment or the drawdown schedule, as I said. And I mean, certainly, as I indicated when we did introduce this bill, the pension reform is a work in progress. It's taken this long, but I think we have hit some really important critical changes already, but we recognize that there is more to do, and certainly this government is committed to tackling the real issues facing the country.
So I guess what we're hearing from you is that over the next 12 months or so, we're going to see additional changes both to investment regulations. One of the complaints you hear an awful lot is my pension performance has been very bad, and that might be because the plan itself has performed badly. It may be because the investment regulations restrict certain investments that could be potentially performing better. Is a whole variety of things. So the concerns that people have whereby they're worried about performance, we should start to see changes to regulation which allow a broader range of investments, which should have scope to allow us to solve that problem potentially.
That's the hope and the expectation, yes, is to kind of bring those regulations in line with kind of what is the best practice today.
And then for those who are retiring or about to retire, they will have a broader range of options as to what they can do with their pot of money. That's not to say they'll be able to take it all in one go and go and spend it, but they'll have a broader range of things they can do so that they have a sensible retirement income each month for the 25, 27 years that they are living post-retirement.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I do believe, unfortunately, that we're very close to the end of our time. It's amazing how quickly 30 minutes goes by. And so, Minister Rivers, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you on the show today. Before I go, I just want to remind all of our listeners that today's show will be able to be heard as a podcast on the CFA Society Cayman Islands webpage. And we would encourage you, if you have any questions or topics that you wish us to cover, we had a number of people who have asked us to cover the pension industry and cover the pension law. If you do have questions, send us an email at moneysense@candw.ky. With all that said, thank you once again. Goodbye, and please tune in 2 weeks' time.
Money Sense is brought to you with the support of One TradeX.